Hello, I'm Lisa, and today we're going to be doing the science of, well, flowers. So, have you ever looked at a flower really closely? Really closely? Closer than that. We're going to take a really good look at lots of different types of flowers. I've got some big ones. I've got smaller ones. Smaller still, fancy frilly ones. What else have I got? I've got some ones that look like lilies. I've got an orchid that I took from a plant in my kitchen. I've got some plants from my garden. Now, I'm filming this in the middle of winter, so there aren't very many flowers in my garden at the moment, but I still found some, so I'll have a good look at those. I've got some that haven't even opened yet, because, as I say, it's winter. And you know what? They don't even have to be fresh. If you're going to have a really close look at a flower and take it apart to see what's inside, it doesn't matter if it's a bit old and had it. This one's been in the vase for a week, but we're going to have a really good look at it all the same. So first we're going to look inside a tulip. Lovely red tulip here. Now when you look at that red bit, you might think that they're all petals, but actually they're not. The very outside layer are actually the sepals that have been modified to look like petals. But let's open them up and see what's inside. So those outer three are the modified sepals. And then inside that we've got the petals. And then inside that you can now see the big stamens, which are the anthers on top of big thick filaments. And then that's what you can see on the outside there. And the bit in the centre is called a carpel. And it's got on this flower, a triangular shaped stigma at the top. And below that there are some other parts. Let's tuck it up closed again. The petals and then the sepals. Let's look in another one. I'm going to take it apart. It's got a yellow tulip this time. And again, have a look. Look at those things that look like petals. They're actually the sepals of the outer layer. I'm going to just snap off the stem there, get rid of the leaves, get that out the way. So if you look at the bud of a tulip, those sepals will still be green. And then they gradually change to match the petals as the bud begins to open. Right, have a good look at it and we'll start to take it apart. So I'm going to start by taking off those three outer sepals. And that leaves us with the petals. So we'll take off the three petals. And there you can see those lovely big clear stamens and the stigma at the top of the carpel in the centre. The stamens are made up of two parts. The top part is the anther, that's the big fat long bit on this flower, and then below that there's the sort of strands that it's held up by, and that's called the filament. Different flowers, as you will discover, have different shaped anthers and filaments. So the stamen's the male part of the flower. Anther at the top is where the pollen would be. A flower that's ready, the pollen would be coming off there. Left in the middle, we've got the female part of the plant. The whole thing's called the carpel. The top is the stigma. Below that, there's a bit called the style, and below that is the ovary. Break off the stem just to get it out of the way. Now on a tulip, the style's ever so short. So this fat bit here is the ovary, and I'm going to try and break it open with my nails. I'm not using a knife or scissors, just my fingernails. Break it open and see if we can find some ovules inside. The ovules are what will eventually form into the seed. They are just visible, tiny white dots. If you're lucky enough to have one of those little microscopes that clips onto a phone or a tablet camera, they're really good for having a good look at these. Tiny white ovules right in the middle there. So that's the female part of the flower in the centre. So let's try a different flower, a Primula, picked from my garden in the middle of winter. Now this time you can see classic sepals. They were the leafy looking bit that was on the outside of the bud, and now they're underneath the flower but still look a bit like leaves. Then you've got the proper petals sitting on the top. Those patterns are to guide insects to the centre of the flower to help with pollination. And the middle of the flower is deep inside. So let's take this one apart. I'm going to start by peeling off that outer ring of sepals. There they all are. And you can see that the middle of the petals are all joined together to make almost a tube. And that's where the nectar will be for the insects that pollinate the flower. So let's have a go at taking the petals off. They're all joined together to make this tube, so they're making it a bit tough for me. There we go. Carefully tearing at the petals. Now look really closely in the very, very middle. We're going to try and spot the stamens. Can you see the tiny, tiny yellow anthers? Looks like they're stuck to the bottom of the petals. They're not, it's just that their filaments are really, really short and thin. But you can just see those yellow anthers. And then in the very middle, left now, sticking out of the middle, there's the female part. You see the tiny dot that is the stigma on top of a long, thin, skinny style going down into the round, bulbous ovary. Pop that out of the way and we'll see if we can get a closer look at the stamens. Those yellow anthers, you can just see them. Again, if you can get a little microscope or a hand lens, do use them. But you can just see the anthers on their very, very thin filaments. Let's have a look at one of them. You just see the anther on my finger? There's the anther. And the filament is so fine that you can barely see it. So remembering that the anther and filament make a stamen, that's the male part. And the stigma, style and ovary are the female. And next, Alstromeria. It's actually a small kind of lily. Beautiful, beautiful flower here. Now, what can you see? Oh, just get rid of those leaves. What can you see on the outside of this lily? Can you see the sepals? That's right. It's another one of those flowers where the sepals have been modified to look like petals. And these ones have been so well modified, they look just like the petals. It's actually quite tricky to spot which is which. So you see me searching and double checking. The sepals form an outer ring, with the petals forming the next layer inside. That's the sepals off, and there are the 3 beautiful petals remaining. Take off the 3 petals. And that's revealing the enormous stamens. Look at the length of the filaments on those. And the anthers are covered in grey pollen. Beautiful, big, thick filaments there. So I'm going to take off the stamens very carefully and see if you can spot the carpel. You're going to have to look very carefully to see if you can spot the carpel in the middle of these stamens. Have you spotted it yet? Yep, it's that one in the middle. The style looks just the same as the filaments, but instead of having that big anther, it's got a tiny stigma on the top. Big ovary underneath, so I'm going to break that open and show you the ovules. And the ovules in these lovely flowers are really easy to spot. You can see how easily they would turn into seeds. Look, one of them's even fallen off on the towel there. Have a really good look at the ovules inside the ovary there. So now we've got a chrysanthemum, and you'll see it looks a bit like a daisy. Now, flowers like this are very different from the ones we've looked at so far, but I've got a good reason for showing you this one. First, what can you see on the outside? Yep, sepals. Then we've got petals, but it's the middle of the flower that is very different. Let's have a closer look at what's in the middle. Get a few petals out of the way. Now these are called compound flowers. And when I get the sepals out the way, you'll start to see why. We haven't got a nice neat ring of stamens and then a nice neat collection of carpels. We've got these funny yellowy bits in the middle instead. And these yellow bits are actually themselves stamens and carpels. They're like tiny, tiny flowers in their own right. So that's why they're called compound flowers. They're actually lots and lots of tiny, tiny flowers all stuck together. But the good reason for showing it to you is if I knock off some of these flowers from the middle, they have a massive receptacle. And the receptacle is the bulgy bit at the top of the stem that all the parts of the flower are stuck to. And you can see that really well in this type of flower. Next, a carnation. Beautiful flowers, much loved and bred by plant breeders to look very different and make loads of colours. You see the sepals on the outside? And you can see how they've come from being the outer covering of the bud, which I've just got rid of. There's the lovely sepals. And let's get them out of the way. I'm having to be quite careful here because the petals, the very, very base of the petals is really, really narrow. Oops, stems come off. But the base of the petals is really narrow and they will suddenly go very floppy. You can just see the receptacle. Having taken off the stem, the receptacle is what's hiding inside the sepals there. And you can see the very narrow base of all the petals. But where are the stamens and the carpels? Well, they are there in the middle, but the complicated breeding of the petals has made it harder to spot them. There they are. Well, they're the stamens. You see the anthers sticking on the top of those long, fine filaments? The carpels, you'll have to really look closely for to spot those. So I'm going to get some of the petals out of the way and show you what's going on. Now, after years and years of breeding by plant breeders, the petals, the flower structure of these carnations has got more and more complicated. So you can see what I'm picking out now are tiny bits of petal, little petals that have become attached to the stamens. You can just see the dots of the anthers on the top of those really long, fine filaments. So the bigger petals are just petals, but the way they've been bred, we've now got these tiny, tiny petals as well attached to some of the stamens. Have you spotted the carpels yet? The carpels are right in the middle. There are two of them. Can you see them? Get rid of those last couple of stamens. see the female parts? Yeah, that's them. The female parts, the carpels, have got really long, twisted, thick styles. There's two of them twisted around each other. And the base of it, that bulbous bit, the blob at the bottom, is the ovary. I promised you a rose. A very wilted, sad-looking rose. Let's get the leaves out of the way. And you know how I'm going to start this? What's on the outside? What protected the flower while it was still inside its bud? Yep, there are the sepals. Lovely big thick sepals. And then we look at the petals. Now, wild roses are much smaller and simpler. Garden roses have been bred by plant breeders over years and years and years to be much more complicated, have many more petals, and have many more colours too. But they still follow the same basic structure. So see if you can spot the ring of stamens appearing, the male part of the flower. There they are. You can see the yellow anthers on the tops of the stamens, and there are very fine filaments below them. Let's get rid of the petals and have a closer look. So the yellow anthers on the top of the stamens, pretty obvious, but can you see the carpels? Remember, the female part of the flower is right in the middle. They're a bit harder to spot, but they're the slightly paler, slightly greeny yellow bit in the middle. Let's get rid of some of the stamens and we should be able to see them a bit more clearly. And you can see the fine filaments coming off as I'm pulling away the stamens. And then in the middle, you can see the greeny yellow top of the stigma, all the stigmas in the middle, on quite short styles. And then they go down to the ovaries. So that's the female parts of the flower in the middle. The stigma, the style, and then can we find the ovaries? Well, they're in that big bulbous bit underneath. So let's see if I can break that open. It's quite tough, this one. And again, if you have got access to a lens, a magnifying lens, or one of those little microscopes that clips over the camera on a phone or a tablet, or there's little digital microscopes that plug in to phones or tablets or laptops, then you can have a much closer look at all these bits and spot the fine detail. Inside those ovaries there, each one contains one ovule. Remember, the ovules are the bits that form the individual seeds. So there's our rose. I promise. And so, an orchid, Phalaenopsis. Now this is the one that you see in supermarkets being sold as pot plants. They're very popular, and you can see why. Their flowers are absolutely stunning. Everything you see here is petals, just petals. Now orchids are amazing flowers. Each one has adapted itself to attract the animal that it needs to spread the pollen. So this one has a long tube at the back to hold nectar to attract insects. Some orchids are pollinated by moths, some by bees, some by flies, some by birds. And every one of them is shaped differently to attract just the right animal. Some orchids even look like the insects that they're trying to attract. Just look at the amazing shapes. If you're lucky enough to have one of these sitting at home, or know someone who does, ask if you can have a really good look at these petals. Aren't they glorious? So how many different types of flowers can you find? What makes them similar? What makes them different? Can you find different colours of pollen when you're looking? Then look up diagrams and details in books that you can find. But don't forget to wash your hands when you've finished.